I think we've all been there, right? When you're with a patient and you see a wound and it's just not healing, it's like one of the biggest challenges I think we face as clinicians, especially now, with the cost of living and everything. It just feels like it's getting harder and harder for people to access the healthcare they need.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that Wound Australia is really trying to get ahead of, with their 5-point plan. Have you had a look at that at all?
Yeah, I have, and I mean, it's really interesting. They're really trying to make a difference with this chronic wound problem. What's really incredible is just how many people it actually affects. Like they're saying 450,000 Australians every year are dealing with chronic wounds. That's a lot of people.
It's a huge number, isn't it? And then when you think about the cost, too, over $6.6 billion a year for the healthcare system, it's just massive.
Yeah, it's a bit mind-blowing, those numbers. And it makes you think about the actual people behind all those statistics, right? I mean, the plan mentions that on average, someone with a chronic wound is spending over $4,000 a year out of their own pocket. Just imagine the stress that adds on top of everything else they're going through.
Absolutely. I mean, it makes you realize that all these issues are tied together,
Yeah.
The rising cost of living, it's putting pressure on everyone. And it's particularly tough for people who are dealing with chronic conditions like wounds.
Yeah, it's a tough situation all around, really. And the plan acknowledges that. I mean, it talks about the challenges that clinicians face too, right?
Exactly. Like trying to navigate a complex system, sometimes you just feel lost. And then patients are putting off treatment because they can't afford it. And it's like,
Okay.
we see that all the time, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah, I totally get that. One thing that really resonated with me was their idea about extending the chronic wound consumable scheme, like including the actual time it takes to treat patients. I mean, right now it only covers the products, but the time is valuable too, right?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It could really help, I think, to take some of the financial burden off both patients and us, clinicians. And I think it ties in with their other point about making expert wound support more accessible.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it makes you think, is there a way to work kind of smarter and not harder? You know, like
Hmm.
be more efficient with our time and resources, especially with wound care because it's so common and it can be pretty complex.
Totally. And I think this is where technology can really make a difference. Like, have you heard of Caris for Wounds?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
But fill me in, like what exactly does it do?
So basically, it uses AI to help with all sorts of things, like imaging the wound, measuring it, assessing it, and even keeping track of it over time, all that monitoring stuff. It's pretty amazing, actually. Like, you can just take a photo of the wound with your phone, and the app will work out the area, what kind of tissue is there, all sorts.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly helpful, especially when you're super busy.
Yeah.
Does it, can you connect it to any other systems that we might already be using?
Yeah, so there's a website for it, and it's all about, remote monitoring, doing those teleconsultations, things like that. So you can easily share information with colleagues. And like it's been validated by some pretty reputable places like TTSH Singapore. So it's not just some random app, it's got some backing.
Oh, that's good to know. So it's reliable. Now, the 5-point plan, they talk a lot about wound care education, right?
Hmm.
Is there anything in Cares for Wounds that sort of addresses that side of things?
Actually, there is. It's got like these clinical reference guides built in, and it really encourages everyone to document things in a standardized way, which is super helpful, especially for junior staff or anyone who's maybe not as experienced with wound care. It helps bring everyone up to speed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It can kind of bridge that knowledge gap, which I think is a big part of what the plan is all about.
Hmm.
It also makes me think about their point about the National Wound Prevention Campaign. The second point, could a tool like this help with picking things up early, like before a wound even becomes chronic?
Absolutely. I mean, getting a good assessment early on is crucial, right? If you can spot those subtle changes in a wound that might signal trouble, I mean, that's what we want to do. Catch it early and intervene. It could make a huge difference, really.
Okay, so it seems like Cares for Wounds really does tick a lot of the boxes in that plan. But let's get practical for a second. What kind of issues does it actually solve for us? Like in our day-to-day work, what are the pain points?
I'd say one of the biggest things is the time it takes to measure a wound and assess it, all that manual stuff. With Caris for Wounds, it's done in literally seconds. And it can even analyze the tissue. Like, it can pick up on potential infections even before we might see it with our own eyes.
Wow, that's incredible. But does it really work that fast?
Mm.
And how accurate are the measurements? I mean, there's always a bit of a learning curve with any new technology, right?
Oh, for sure. But honestly, from what I've seen, it's pretty intuitive. It's all on your mobile, which, let's face it, we're all glued to anyway. And they've got training and stuff to get you up to speed.
Okay, that's good to know. But even with the best technology, there can be hiccups, right? Especially when you're busy and you're trying to get things done.
Mm.
Have you come across anything in your research that could help us avoid those common mistakes people make?
You know what? There's actually a really helpful document they have. It's called Pilot Protocols, and it actually highlights some potential issues and how to get around them. For example, making sure you take the picture of the wound from the same angle each time so you get a consistent measurement. They even show you examples of good and bad photos.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Visuals are always helpful. I know I can be guilty of trying to improvise sometimes, which doesn't always work out.
Huh. Yeah, I know what you mean. They specifically say not to do things like using like a sheet to try and create a cropped effect. It's tempting to just fall back on those old habits, but using the app's features properly ensures you get the most accurate data.
That's a really good point. I can see how trying to cut corners could mess up the results.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how it aligns with the 5-point plan and how it can help us in our daily practice, but what about actual results? Does it actually live up to all the hype?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? From what I've seen in the studies, it's actually pretty impressive. For example, they've found a twofold improvement in phalanges scores.
Now just remind me, what does the Flanga score actually tell us?
It's basically a way to judge how well a wound is healing, looking at things like, granulation tissue, necrosis, all that. A higher score generally means the wound is doing well. So seeing a twofold improvement, that's a really big deal.
That is pretty significant. Were there any other findings that really stood out to you?
They've also seen that it can cut the assessment time down by 60% compared to doing it the traditional way. And get this, they've found it can reduce overall costs by a whopping 265%.
Wow, that's amazing. But those are just numbers, right? Are there any, real patient stories that demonstrate the impact of using this?
Oh, there's a really inspiring one about a woman in her 90s who had this pressure injury that just wouldn't heal. It was going on for months. They started using CARES 4 wounds with her and doing weekly teleconsultations, and her wound started to improve so much. Like within weeks, it was healing really well, and she could even move around better.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's stories like that that really bring it home, don't they? It's not just about the technology itself, but how it actually makes a difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. And it goes back to the whole point of the Wound Australia 5-point plan. We need to find these new solutions that can improve care, but they also need to be practical. They need to work within our healthcare system, and they need to consider the pressures that both patients and clinicians are facing.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a real turning point in wound care.
Yeah.
And it's exciting to think about what we can achieve with technologies like this. But I'm curious, what about the potential downsides? Are there any concerns or limitations we should be aware of?
That's a really good question. I mean, the technology itself seems very promising, but there are always challenges with actually implementing something new and getting people to use it. We need to make sure clinicians get proper training and that it fits in with how we already work.
Right. And we can't forget the human element either, can we? Technology can be a great tool, but it's not going to replace our expertise or the compassion we bring to caring for our patients.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance. We can leverage the technology, but we can't lose that personal connection that's so important in healthcare.
You're absolutely right. It's not about technology versus human care. It's about using technology to make the care we provide even better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a perfect note to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We'll continue exploring how Cares for Wounds can empower clinicians, but always keeping in mind the importance of using it responsibly and ethically to get the best possible outcomes for our patients. It really is all about using the right tools, right? So we can focus on what matters, taking care of our patients.
Speaking of tools, do you remember those adhesive stickers we used to use for measuring wounds? Those little reference stickers? Whew, such a pain.
Oh, tell me about it. Trying to get them to stick properly, especially on a tricky spot, it wasn't exactly a comfortable experience for the patient.
Exactly. And it took forever, let's be honest.
Yeah.
With Cures for Wounds, you just snap a picture and the app does all the work. It's so much simpler.
It really is. And you know what? It's a huge help for junior staff, especially. When you're still learning, having a tool like that can be so reassuring. It takes out some of the guesswork. It standardizes everything, which means everyone's on the same page, regardless of their experience.
That's a really good point. Because wound assessment can be pretty subjective, right? Everyone sees things a little differently. This way, there's more consistency.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the documentation side of things. I used to spend so much time writing up all those notes about wound size, tissue type, all that. Now, Cares for Wounds just generates the report for you. It's a lifesaver, honestly.
It's like having a virtual assistant.
Yeah.
And not only does it save time, but it also means the records are more accurate and consistent, which is so important.
It really highlights the importance of standardization, which is something the Wound Australia 5-point plan really emphasizes. It's not just about having the latest tech, it's about using it to actually improve the quality of care across the board.
And speaking of the 5-point plan, we've talked a lot about how Cares for Wounds aligns with their goals, like improving access to expert support and focusing on prevention. But are there any areas where it might not be as effective? Or any potential conflicts we should be aware of?
That's a good question. I think one challenge potentially is making sure everyone has access to it. The plan talks a lot about reaching underserved communities, like people in rural areas. We need to make sure cost and infrastructure aren't barriers, especially for smaller clinics or those with limited resources.
That's a really important point. We don't want to end up creating even more inequality in healthcare.
Exactly. It's about working together, as a community to make sure this technology actually benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about data privacy and security, especially when we're dealing with sensitive patient information.
Absolutely. Any technology that stores and transmits patient data needs to be top-notch when it comes to security. That's something we should definitely be looking at closely.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Between embracing new innovations and making sure we're doing it responsibly.
Couldn't agree more. We want to use these technologies to improve care, but we have to do it in a way that protects our patients' privacy and well-being.
That's a great point. So, we've talked about the benefits of Cures for Wounds, but are there any potential downsides, any concerns or limitations we should be thinking about?
That's a really important question. I mean, the technology itself looks great, but there are always challenges with implementation, right? Making sure everyone's trained properly and that it fits into our existing workflows.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the human element. Technology can be a powerful tool, but it can never replace our expertise and compassion.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, leveraging the technology, but never losing sight of the importance of that personal connection.
That's a really good point. It's not technology versus human care. It's about using technology to enhance the care we provide.
Exactly. And I think one of the most exciting things about Cares for Wounds is how it can actually improve communication, not just between clinicians, but also with patients. Imagine being able to share those visual reports with your patients so they can actually see how their wound is healing. You can really help them feel more involved in their care.
That's such a good point. Keeping patients informed and engaged is so important, and those visuals can be really powerful and helps them understand what's happening and gives them more confidence in their treatment.
Exactly. And it can also help build that trust and rapport between clinicians and patients. When patients feel like they're part of the team, they're more likely to stick to their treatment plans.
Yeah, it's about moving away from that doctor knows best approach and creating a more collaborative relationship where patients are active participants in their own health.
I completely agree. And I think technology like this can really help us make that shift. It gives us the tools to not only manage wounds better, but also to communicate more effectively with everyone involved.
It's really about using technology to deliver care that's more patient-centered,
Yeah.
more holistic. And I think that fits perfectly with the overall vision of the Wound Australia 5-point plan.
Absolutely. It's about creating a system that works for everyone, patients, clinicians, and the healthcare system as a whole. And that's something I think we can all get behind.
It feels like we're really moving towards a much more data-driven approach to wound care, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, one of the biggest things with Cares for Wounds is how it brings standardization and data right to the front. Think about all the issues we've had with documentation not being consistent, everyone using different ways to assess wounds, and it's hard to track progress properly. It's such a pain, honestly. Especially when you're trying to work with other healthcare professionals. Everyone's got their own way of doing things, and it's like trying to piece it all together is a nightmare.
Exactly. Cares for Wounds just brings everyone onto the same page. It standardizes everything, how we work, how we assess, how we document. And that's not only good for communication, but it gives us all this data we can actually use.
It's like we're finally speaking the same language when it comes to wound care, which is amazing.
Exactly. And with all this standardized data, we can start to see trends, measure how well things are working, and ultimately come up with better treatments and prevention strategies. It could really change the game.
That's a really powerful thought. It's not just about collecting data for the sake of it. It's about using it to actually improve how we care for our patients. Which brings us back to that question we were talking about before. Could this be the key to making quality wound care more accessible, especially now with everything costing so much? I really think it has the potential. I mean, it streamlines everything, it helps reduce costs, and it gives clinicians accurate data. It ticks so many boxes in the Wound Australia 5-point plan.
It's really exciting to think about what we could achieve, but I also know that new technologies don't always live up to the hype.
Yeah.
What would you say to those clinicians out there who might be a bit skeptical about all this?
Oh, I totally get it. It's important to be cautious and do your homework before you jump into anything new. I'd say look at the research, talk to colleagues who have used it, see what their experience has been like. The initial results are promising, but we need more people using it and more research to see the long-term impact.
That's a good point. We need to be critical thinkers, right? It's not about just following the latest trend. It's about making informed decisions for our patients. So as we wrap up this deep dive into wound care and cares for wounds, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all this?
I think the key message is that we're at a really important point in wound care. The challenges are huge, but so are the opportunities. We've got these technologies like Cares for Wounds that have the potential to completely change the way we work, make things better for our patients, and make quality care more accessible to everyone. It's up to us to use these advancements wisely and responsibly so we can build a better future for wound care in Australia.
That's a great way to put it. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep this conversation going. Learn more about Cures for Wounds. Think about how it could fit into your practice and share your experiences. The future of wound care is being shaped right now, and we need you to be a part of it.